Do you want to increase your speaking ability and create a flood of interest after your speech? Do you want to leverage your expertise and become a thought leader in your field? Well, if you do, we must listen to Neil Gordon. Welcome to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Katrina Burrus, and today we have our guest, Neil Gordon. Neil, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me, Katrina.
So Neil, tell us about what are the most common mistakes among public speakers so we can avoid them.
When you think of a public speaker, you're usually going to have an expert in some field, in some topic or subject matter. And that expertise has usually come to them over many years of experience, immersion, and working their thought process out. But the mistake that so many of them make is that they basically vomit all of that information out into the audience during their 45-minute speech or however long they have, and try to cram as much content into that time as they can. It's something we might call the show up and throw up. And so with all of this information going through their head, what they think is that the audience is just ready for all of that. And the truth is that if we don't meet the audience where they're at, they're more likely just to tune us out. And this becomes even more problematic when we use a lot of fancy jargon, technical terms, even made up terms, because we're really precious about our intellectual property and all of that. And so the main problem is just the show up and throw up. And then secondary to that is just when we throw up all of our content, we're using super technical and advanced terminology to do it.
So it's really customizing our speech to the audience instead of showing off our expertise.
Right. Showing off is absolutely an understandable instinct because, again, we know so much and we can help so much. It's not like an arrogant thing. It's like, I want people to really get how valuable this is. But again, if the audience doesn't even know anything about you or doesn't know anything about that topic that you're there to talk about, then they're just going to check out and start looking at their phone while they're supposed to be listening.
So, okay, it's really addressing your speech to the audience at hand. But then how do you make it unforgettable? Sometimes you might simplify it so much that it becomes common and evident. So how do you make it unforgettable?
There are a lot of different things and principles that we could look at, Katrina, in terms of really giving it that unforgettable quality. I'm reminded of a client who had done a lot of public speaking trainings and learned from a lot of people. And then I had her do one simple thing at the very beginning of her speech. And she gave the same speech. I hadn't really helped her beyond that initial thing yet. And she just did that one change. And she came back and said to me and gave me a testimonial to this effect as well, that after she made this one little shift, she got a standing ovation for the first time. And she also made almost 6 figures in sales of her services that day. Okay, so what is it I had her do? What many speakers do, and this is another mistake many speakers make, is that they're introduced by an MC or a host or someone like that before they come out onto stage, right? And so they say, thank you, and please join me in welcoming so-and-so. And you come out and the speaker comes out and they say, oh, thank you so much. It's so nice to be here. And oh, isn't so-and-so who just introduced me great? And how about a nice round of applause for so-and-so? And there's this visiting, there's this entreating the audience to like them. And this squanders one of the biggest opportunities that a speaker has, in that there's a tension that happens at the very beginning of a speech. And this is much more so in a live presentation than the virtual ones that have become much more common since COVID started. But with a live presentation, there's all these people in the room looking at you and you haven't said anything or done anything yet. It's like the start of a race right after they say on your mark and get set, but before they say go. And there's all that tension right before it starts. What if you harness that tension by, instead of squandering and saying, oh, it's so nice to be here and smoothing everything out, you just start with a story. As soon as you get on stage, you look at them for a moment maybe, and then just start into something like, a longtime friend of mine didn't know what to do, and then describe the crisis that your friend is in, or something like that. Everyone's eyes will just be on you, and they will be with you because you didn't just apologize for yourself on stage. You just leaned into it and said, hey, you got to hear this story. And so this becomes a contributing factor to your original question, Katrina, and being unforgettable is that if you have them from the moment you start speaking, they'll hear pretty much, I mean, there are other things to do as well, but they'll at the very least be with you and hear you and listen to what you say for most of, if not the entire speech.
So how do you get someone's interest in your expertise the first 30 seconds? I know you mentioned stories, but is there something else that one needs to be aware of?
When it comes to a speech, the 30 seconds winds up being probably is going to be about telling the story. But if you either don't want to give a story or you only have like a minute or something like that to give an elevator speech or something along those lines, super concise. Another mistake that many people make is that they just launch into their solution, their coaching or their management philosophy or whatever it is, their way of looking at the world. And again, this just starts with the speaker. This starts with the expert being lost in their own world. Whereas if you instead turn the tables and started with the problem that your audience cares about, you will be far more likely to draw them in, get them invested in hearing what your solution is eventually. A really quick story: when my father retired from school teaching, he did some substitute teaching and he didn't get a key to unlock and lock his door at the high school he was subbing at. And he felt kind of humiliated by this, but rather than write the principal and say, I feel humiliated and my authority is being undermined by not having a key, he started the email to the principal about how unsafe so many students felt because during lockdown the previous year, the subs couldn't lock their doors. And so the kids didn't feel like they were safe. And so he started with a problem the principal cared about solving, which was the safety of the students. And the next day, the principal said, I hear you, let's meet. And he got him the keys, and the other subs got keys as well.
Great.
So that powerful influence was just all about start framing it in terms of the problem the principal cared about, right?
Yes, absolutely. It's really, why should they listen to you? Because you got to grasp their attention by the problem they're struggling with.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I know that you've spoken a lot. I think the term you use is brilliant jerk.
Yes, indeed.
Right.
I transform.
I'm not a fan of people who act like jerks, but I'm a fan of you identifying this because I've known them and many of us have known those people. And if you go to a brilliant jerk and tell them they have to change the way they show up at the office, is that really going to help? But if you started framing the conversation in terms of a problem that the brilliant jerk cares about solving, they might be more inclined to listen to you at the beginning.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of knowing who your audience is.
Yes, and because the brilliant jerk got where they are by being a brilliant jerk. So if you tell them they got to change, they feel they're going to threaten in their own ability to succeed. So absolutely. Okay, so the first 30 seconds is really grabbing the audience attention by talking about a problem they want to solve and then coming with a solution. Is there anything else in the first 30 seconds that we need to be aware of?
Another nice tip, Katrina, is that once you've established the problem, a really helpful thing to do is to then identify the typical flawed solutions that most people try and fail to succeed with. And so let's just make this up off the top of my head. Let's say that you are an expert in kicking the smoking habit. And so you're addicted to cigarettes and you smoke 2 packs a day and you hate yourself and you're ostracized by your family. That's the problem that they care about, right? They just feel terrible about this awful habit. But then you identify the typical solutions that don't work. You've tried quitting cold turkey. You've tried the nicotine patch. You've tried the gum. You've tried vaping. You've tried all these things and you just can't kick this craving for the nicotine. And like, no matter what you try, you're always a slave to the cigarettes. And then they'll be like, yeah, I've tried all those things. It just doesn't work. You primed them to be incredibly ready for the alternative. If your solution is a departure from the norm, if you have a unique way of solving a problem, you first set up the problem, then you identify the things that don't work so that the listener is primed to hear what will work.
Very good advice. Of course, they might have tried all those ways to stop smoking, and then you have a solution, so they're eager to try it out. Absolutely.
Exactly.
Okay, so we identify the problem. We identify what were the flawed solutions. Anything else?
At that point, I tend to encourage people to feel comfortable with moving into their solution. I'd say that, I mean, none of this is, I like to say, Katrina, that the only hard and fast rule of communications is that there are no hard and fast rules. That being said, I feel like once you've established the problem and then identified typical solutions, that's as much pressure as you might want to put on yourself in that initial communication. And then, yeah, I do have suggestions as to how one can frame their solution in a truly unforgettable way. But I feel like by that point, I'd say most people can feel comfortable moving into that part of the conversation.
So let's say that, okay, now you come to the solution or you explain it, and you want to get across the company's unique value in the marketplace. So basically a bit of sales. How do you introduce that?
What a lot of people will just focus on is what it is that they do, and they just describe their product or their service. And that becomes the extent of what they would consider their unique selling proposition. They say, well, and I provide these services, or I provide this product, and whatever it is. But that's skipping over a step that is overlooked by most people, but it's a certain ingredient that shows up in the 46 of them 50 most popular TED Talks, in the best-selling nonfiction books. You can look up thought leaders like Aristotle and Socrates and Sun Tzu from The Art of War, and you look them up on Brainy Quote and other sites like that that have all of these sayings that they said 2,500 years ago. And you see this same pattern of this one technique again and again. And so I mentioned The Art of War just now with Sun Tzu, and on line 18 of the first chapter of The Art of War, Sun Tzu says this: all of warfare is deception. In one sentence, he basically provides the secret sauce, the recipe for success, that if you want to win a war, you deceive your opponent. He's distilled the entire thing down to one outcome, winning the war, and the entire thing down to one action that gets you that outcome, which is deception. And so this simple cause and effect sentence is something I call the silver bullet. And when you incorporate into your messaging and into your speaking and your elevator speech and all of that stuff, if you incorporate this silver bullet-like statement, people will not just learn what you do, they'll get the secret formula for why what you do is successful.
You got to give us an example, because maybe some people don't understand what a silver bullet is. Maybe our European friends. Mm-hmm.
Of course. So let's look at a popular TED Talk by a man named Dan Pink. Dan Pink gave a TED Talk in the late 2000s that now has tens of millions of views, and it's called The Puzzle of Motivation. So how can a leader, we have leaders listening to us here on this podcast, of course, how can a leader motivate their workforce to be more engaged, to get more done, and to perform better? And so what Dan says is that most people, what they do is they think that carrots and sticks, rewards and punishments, are the way to motivate, right? But what his silver bullet says about 2/3 of the way into his TED Talk is that the secret to high performance is not rewards and punishment, but that unseen intrinsic drive to do things because they matter. And so the basic message, the solution, is to help the workforce to see how what their contribution is, like to see how their contribution matters to the greater whole of the organization as well as the world around us. And so if we were doing an elevator speech as Dan Pink's talk kind of thing, we might say, leaders at many companies struggle to motivate their workforce to inspire the highest performance in their employees that they can. What they typically think they need to do is carrots and sticks, to either threaten them with punishment or to bribe them with some sort of bonus or some sort of reward. But the key to high performance is not rewards and punishments, but that unseen intrinsic drive to do things because they matter. And then what they would say at the end of all of that is then they say the actual service. What we provide as a consulting firm are services that help leaders to show their teams how their work matters and help them to become more engaged and more invested in the workplace.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. You said you should deceive your opponent. What's the link to what you just said?
Oh, forgive me. The all of warfare is deception is just another example of a silver bullet. I'm not actually conveying a message of deception, that's a valuable thing to do in general. It's just he wrote that 2,500 years ago and people still quote it in pop culture. So I like using that example as a way to show that when you take an entire book or entire area of expertise and distill it down to one sentence, one cause and effect sentence like that, it can be very powerful. So all of warfare is deception is an example of a silver bullet. And so is Dan Pink's The Secret to High Performance is not rewards and punishments, but that unseen intrinsic drive to do things because they matter. And I can provide other examples of silver bullets as well, but that was really only the point of bringing up Sun Tzu. It's just another example of how this kind of messaging works.
I see. So don't really say what the audience expects. Do something that they don't expect. Could I summarize it like that?
Well, we can look at unexpectedness as a very powerful tool. And in terms of deception, if we're looking at that as a theme of what we do, one of the things I like to teach people about is how to really captivate their audience, not just at the beginning of the speech, but throughout, like I talked about at the beginning, also throughout. And there are different ways you can do it. And one way you could keep your audience on their toes is to misdirect them. You can do that. You could say, hey, I have this story about this amazing thing that happened. And then you come clean with your audience after you tell the story. None of that's true, actually. It's the very opposite. A good example of that is the TED speaker, Tim Urban, who talks about procrastination. And it's probably like a top 5 or 6 TED Talk of all time as well. It's like even more popular than Dan Pink's now. And he talks about procrastination. And he tells this story about how he wrote this term paper, or this master's thesis or something like that in like 2 days, like an 40 or 80 page paper, something crazy like that in 2 days. And then he says that the department calls him afterwards, like a week later, and says, is this Tim Urban? And he goes, yeah. We just read your thesis. It's the best thesis we've ever seen. And then he comes clean a moment later, said, none of that happened. It was a terrible thesis. I just wanted you all to think that I was amazing, kind of thing. And so it was this funny moment of misdirection where he did deceive his audience a little bit, but then came clean right afterwards. And it got a laugh and it kept them invested in what he was saying.
Yeah, excellent. Very good. So that's another approach. So How can someone convey a solution that most people don't know they need? Okay, so your consumer doesn't really know they need it. So that's even a bigger challenge to convince them that they do.
Yeah, it's a really important thing for us to discuss, Katrina, because a lot of people have found solutions to problems that people don't know they have, or they think that they have a surface level problem, and what they actually have is a more foundational problem. And your solution addresses it at that foundation. And so there's not one absolute way to do this, but one powerful way you could look at this is the art of the reframe, where, much like we've talked about already today, you start with the problem that they believe they have, and you identify the typical solutions. But then before you provide your solution, you could actually reframe it as not the problem they think they have, but with a little bit of evidence, a little bit of persuade, like you provide some context and some content around this, but then you say, you don't actually have that problem. You have this problem. And so an example might be, in my world, like people are having stage fright and they're having like this issue with imposter syndrome and being a speaker. And so I could address that as the surface level problem, is that they're afraid to get up and speak and all of that. But then I might reframe it. You don't actually have a problem with nerves. You just have a problem with clarity. And if you understand beyond a shadow of a doubt your unique value, I dare you to be as nervous about sharing. It doesn't mean your nerves completely go away, but when you take true ownership and have complete clarity around why your stuff is so valuable and how to express that concisely, you're going to be a lot less nervous about speaking because you're just going to want to share that with people and just look forward to the opportunity. And so that's a little bit of a reframe. They start with a nervousness problem, which they know they have, but then I reframe it as a clarity problem. And so what a speaker can do, or some entrepreneur or leader or anyone like that, is they could start with the problem that the audience knows they have. And then after going through a couple of paces of building up to it, you could re-diagnose the problem as something more deep.
I see. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we come at the end of our podcast. Where can people get a hold of you?
You can find me at my website, neilcanhelp.com. That's Neil, canhelp.com. And there's a fun little speaker quiz that you can learn about how to captivate your audience on the homepage right there.
Excellent, Neil. This is most interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge and educating us all.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure, Katrina. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Excellent Executive Coaching Podcast. You can subscribe to all future podcasts at excellentexecutivecoaching.com. Join us each Wednesday to learn more about the latest trends in leadership techniques and bring your coaching to the next level. To learn more about Dr. Burris's CEO Mastermind, use the contact form at excellentexecutivecoaching.com.